The Fear Street Saga, Book 1, The Betrayal, written by RL Stine. Published December 22nd, 2015 by Simon Pulse. Read to you by Dave Cap. The beginning. "You cannot do this," Susanna Good shrieked, fear choking her throat. "You cannot do this to us." The officers roughly dragged Susanna and her mother to the door. She heard surprised murmurs as they passed through the commons, whispered questions. The prison loomed ahead, a low clapboard building behind the meeting house. "Why are you doing this to us?" Susanna cried, the words bursting from her throat. "Why are you dragging us from our home?" Benjamin Fear stopped on the path. His voice was low and steady. His eyes locked on Susanna's. "You too will burn before the week is out," he said. Village of Shadyside, 1900. The fire roared like thunder. Above the choking clouds of black smoke, the night sky brightened with a wash of angry scarlet. The flames tossed and crashed like ocean waves, rolling over the blackened mansion, pouring out every window, sweeping up the walls and over the roof until the house was nothing more than a dark core of a raging fireball. Staring down at the fire from the low hill that overlooked the wide lawn, Nora Good pressed her hands over her ears. Even with the fire's roar muffled, she can hear the screams. The screams of those trapped inside the blazing Fear mansion. The screams of everyone she knew, of everyone she loved. "Daniel, come out!" Nora cried, her small voice buried under the avalanche of terrified shrieks, anguished moans, and the unending roar of the spreading flames. "Daniel, I'm here! I am alive! I ran out! I escaped the fire!" Nora shouted. "Where are you? Are you coming out too?" The flames roared louder, as if to answer her. Nora's entire body trembled in dread. She lowered one hand to the amulet on a chain around her neck. The fire had already blazed for more than an hour. Daniel wasn't coming out. No one was coming out. Only minutes after the fire had begun, the Shadyside volunteer firefighters had pulled their horse-drawn water truck onto the lawn of the mansion. But the flames had already swallowed up the entire house. Their faces revealing horror and awe, the firefighters stood by helplessly and watched with the other townspeople who had gathered on the low hill, huddling in small groups, their faces red in the light of the flickering blaze. "You're not coming out, are you, Daniel?" Nora said. "I'll never see you again." She shut her eyes, but even with her eyes closed, she could still see the angry red and orange flames tossing across the inside of her eyelids. Squeezing the small round pendant tightly, Nora sighed. This silver amulet, with its sparkling blue jewels held in place by a silver three-toed claw, like those on a tiny bird's foot, had been given to her by Daniel Fear as a token of his love. "It is all I have of you, Daniel," Nora wailed. Voices rose around her, close by, louder than the thunder of the flames. Nora opened her eyes and turned her gaze on the horrified faces of the people from the village. They clung together, as if frightened for their own lives. "The fire will burn forever," a bearded man cried, his face scarlet, the flames reflected in his eyes. "Look at the house," a frail woman a few feet from Nora cried, pointing. "It is covered with flames, but it does not burn." "It looks as if the sky is on fire," screamed a little girl, hiding her face in her mother's dark skirt. "I always knew this place was evil," the bearded man declared, shielding his eyes with one hand. I always knew the fears would come to no good. They burned up inside their house, someone said. May their evil perish with them, another person added. The firemen didn't even try to put it out. They could not put out this fire. It is not an ordinary fire. It is not a fire from this world. The evil of this house feeds the fire. The house is cursed. The ground is cursed. No, please, stop it! Stop it! Nora shrieked. Unable to shut out their voices, she began running toward the house. Her cloak flapped behind her as she stumbled down the hill and over the lawn. Slipping on the dew-wet grass, she could feel the heat of the fire on her face. Strange shadows flickered over the lawn, black against the reflected scarlet light. Daniel, why is your family so cursed? Nora cried as she ran. What kind of evil brought you and your family to this fiery end? Nora's long hair floated wildly above the flapping cloak. As she ran, she held her arms out, as if ready to embrace the flames. Who is that? Where is she going? Somebody stop her! Alarmed voices rang out from the crowd. Panting loudly, Nora raised an arm to shield her eyes as she ran. She could feel the precious silver amulet bobbing against her throat. Daniel, are you in there? Daniel! Someone stop her! Has she gone mad? Who is she? Is she a fear? The voices finally faded, drowned out by the crackle and roar of the blinding red-orange blaze. It's so hot! So hot! Nora thought. She loosened the cloak and let it fall. I feel as if I'm running into the sun. Now I feel as if I am on fire too. She stopped, choking on the hot smoke. Where am I? She gazed into the flames and suddenly realized she was standing in front of a window. The window of the grand ballroom. The tossing flames made the window glow. Oh! Nora moaned in horror as the faces inside came into view. Faces among the flames. Nora's breath caught in her throat as she stared through the window at the wriggling dark bodies. Are they dancing in there? Dancing with the flames? No. Their faces were twisted in agony. Their darkened bodies writhed in pain. She saw screaming women, flames rolling up their hair. She saw the tortured faces of young men, dark holes where their eyes should have been, their clothing wrapped in fire. Who are these people? Nora wondered, unable to turn her eyes from the ghastly nightmare inside the house. Why are they in the ballroom? Why aren't they consumed by the flames? Why don't they die? And then Nora's eyes focused on a figure in the center of the writhing, screaming crowd. A young girl, wearing a long maroon dress and an old-fashioned cap. Nora gasped as the girl raised her head, and their eyes met. The girl's eyes were eggshell white, glowing white. As Nora gaped in horror, she saw the girl's mouth open into a tortured scream. A scream of rage, of unbearable pain. Then Nora noticed that the girl's hands were tied behind her, tied to a long wooden pole. The girl was tied to a stake, and now her dress was billowing with fire, and the flames were rising up to her face, up to her long blonde hair. The cap burst into flames then. Struggling against the stake, the girl shrieked as she burned. Then, with a low explosion, The flames hid them all behind a rippling yellow curtain. The window burst, glass shattering and flying out. The fire's roar rumbled over her. And still, Nora stood motionless, staring where the screaming girl had been, staring into the wall of flame, staring into the bright, dancing horror. Part 1. Wickham Village, Massachusetts Colony, 1692. Chapter 1. The fire crackled softly. A loud pop sent up a shower of glowing red embers. Susanna Good uttered a cry of surprise and jumped back from the hearth. The embers died at her feet. After straightening the starched white apron she wore over her heavy dark maroon skirt, Susanna bent over the bake kettle to lift the heavy lid and peer inside. Behind her in the small burning room, the baby started to cry. Susanna heard the floorboards creak as her mother made her way to the cradle to see what the problem was. "Susanna!" Martha Good's tone was scolding. "You have wrapped George too tightly again. The poor baby can barely breathe." "The blanket is too small. I had trouble covering him," Susanna complained, still bent over the kettle, a few long golden curls falling out of her bun and over her face. "The blanket will have to do," her mother replied. "It is the best we can afford." She lifted the squalling baby and held him to her face. "Poor George, poor George. What did your sister do to you?" Susanna sighed. "These biscuits are taking so long to bake." Martha Good stepped up behind her. George's cries had softened to quiet whimpers as he lay his head against his mother's stiff white collar. "The fire's too low," her mother said, shaking her head disapprovingly. "You cannot bake in these dying embers. Put more wood on, Susanna." Frowning, Susanna straightened up and tossed the locks of escaped hair behind the white collar that covered the shoulders of her dress. "We need firewood." Susanna was tall and thin. She had sparkling blue eyes, creamy pale skin, and dimples in both cheeks when she smiled. Whenever Martha Good found Susanna gazing into the looking-glass or toying with her golden hair, she scolded her with the same words. "True beauty comes from deeds, not appearance, daughter." As a Puritan, Susanna had been endlessly taught the virtue of modesty. She had been taught that all righteous people are beautiful, and the same in the eyes of the Maker. She felt embarrassed whenever her mother caught her admiring herself, as if her mother had peered inside her soul and found it flawed and unworthy. But at 16, Susanna felt stirrings that excited her as much as they troubled her. She found herself thinking of a certain boy, daydreaming about him as she worked. And she couldn't help but wonder if she was pretty enough to win him over all the other girls in the village of Wickham. Martha Good held the baby and rocked him gently as she stared disapprovingly at the fire. "Where is your father? He will want his biscuits on time, but he will not have them if he is not here." "I believe he is in the commons, tending the cows," Susanna told her. "Cows?" her mother scoffed. "Bags of bones, you mean." She lowered her gaze sadly to the baby she held. "It is a wonder we survived, George." Susanna started towards the door. "I will get the firewood and fetch father. I was going out for a walk anyway," Susanna insisted. "Susanna, please," her mother said, fear clouding her eyes. "You must stop taking solitary walks. You must not do anything at all, to attract attention to yourself." She gazed intently at her pretty daughter. Then she added in a low whisper, "You know the dangers. You know what is going on here." "Yes, Mother," Susanna replied impatiently. "But I think I can go out for a walk without they took Abigail Hopping from her house last night and dragged her to the prison," her mother said softly. "The poor woman's screams woke me." Susanna uttered a shocked gasp. "Abigail Hopping, a witch?" "That's what Benjamin Fear says," Martha Good replied, swallowing hard. "Benjamin accused Abigail of singing songs of the evil one as she prepared the evening meal." "I cannot believe that Abigail Hopping is a witch," Susanna said, shaking her head. "Has she confessed?" "Her trial is at the meeting house tonight," Martha Good said darkly. "Oh, Mother! Will she burn like the others?" Susanna cried, choking out the words. Her mother rocked the baby and didn't reply. "There is so much evil about daughter," she said, finally. "3 witches uncovered in our village by Benjamin Fear since summer began. I beg you to be careful, Susanna. Stay in the shadows. Give no one a reason to suspect you, or even notice you." Susanna nodded. "Yes, Mother. I am only going to the commons for firewood. I shall be back quickly." She pushed the door open, causing a flood of bright sunlight to wash over the dark room. "No! Stop!" her mother cried. Halfway out the door, Susanna turned, her blue eyes flashing, an impatient frown on her face. "Are you going out with your head uncovered?" Martha Good demanded. "Where are your thoughts, dear?" "I'm sorry," Susanna returned to the room, took her white cap from its peg, and pulled it down over her hair. "I will hurry back," she said. She closed the door behind her, and shielding her eyes with one hand from the bright afternoon sunlight, made her way past the chickens pecking the dirt in front of the house. Susanna turned onto the path that led into the village. Walking quickly, her long skirts trailing over the dirt, she passed the Halsey's house. The glass for their windows hadn't yet arrived from England, Susanna saw. The windows were boarded up. Mr. Halsey was bent over his vegetable garden and didn't look up. At the meeting house, she saw someone up on the shingled roof working to attach a brass weather vane above the chimney. The village magistrate, Benjamin Fear, a troubled expression on his face, was just entering the building. Susanna stopped short and waited until he had disappeared inside. A cold shudder ran down her back as she thought of Abigail Hopping. "I know Benjamin Fear is a good and righteous man," Susanna thought, "but I am afraid of him, just as everyone else in Wickham is." As village magistrate, Benjamin Fear was the most powerful man in Wickham. He was also the wealthiest. His home, the biggest in the village, stood across from the meeting house. The aroma of roasting beef wafted out from the summer kitchen as Susanna strode past. The Fears are so prosperous, Susanna thought, unable to suppress a feeling of envy. They won't be having biscuits and gravy for their dinner. The Fears can have roasted meat every night. Susanna knew that the Fear brothers, Benjamin and Matthew, were the most prosperous men in Wickham because they were the most worthy. Since she had been a little girl, she'd been taught that good fortune goes to those who are the most righteous. Thus, Benjamin Fear became magistrate because he was the wisest, most pious man in the village. It was he who conducted the witchcraft trials, and he who insisted the guilty ones be burned, rather than hanged, as they were elsewhere in Massachusetts. Benjamin's younger brother, Matthew, had a farm that prospered while others failed because Matthew Fear was more righteous and faithful than the other farmers. This was plain and simple knowledge. As she passed the meeting house and glanced towards the commons, Susanna found herself thinking about Benjamin's son, Edward Fear. "Edward, where are you? Are you thinking about me?" "Oh!" she cried as she stumbled over an enormous pink pig spotted with black and went sprawling onto the hard ground. The pig grunted a loud protest and scrambled off the path. Susanna picked herself up and brushed the dust off the front of her white apron. "That will teach me not to have improper thoughts," she scolded herself, straightening her cap over her hair. But how can thoughts about Edward be improper? She saw her father at the far end of the commons, the large rectangular pasture in the center of the village. He was busily raking a section of ground and didn't see Susanna wave to him. Mr. Franklin, the blacksmith, was at the anvil in front of his shop, pounding noisily on a sheet of tin as Susanna hurried past. She smiled at Franklin's apprentice, a boy named Arthur Kent, who was tending the bellows, which were nearly twice as big as him. Behind the blacksmith shop were the shimmering green woods. Tall poplars and beech trees leaned in towards the village. Behind these, the woods grew dark, with pines, oaks, and maples. The village woodpile stood at the edge of the woods, logs neatly chopped and stacked, but Susanna's eyes were focused on the woods. Sunlight filtered down the shimmering leaves, sending rays of light darting over the ground. Black and gold monarch butterflies fluttered in and out of the shafts of white light. "I shall take a short walk into the woods," Susanna decided. It felt good to be out of the dark house, away from the heat of the cooking hearth, away from the crying baby, away from her chores and the watchful eyes of her mother, away from the heavy fear that hovered over the entire village these days. Susanna stepped into the woods, dry twigs crackling beneath her heavy black shoes. As soon as she was hidden by the trees, she pulled off her cap and shook her hair free. She walked slowly, raising her face to the shafts of bright sunlight. Her dress caught on a low bramble. She tugged it free and kept walking. A scrabbling sound nearby made her spin around just in time to see a brown and white chipmunk scurry under a pile of dead leaves. Susanna tossed her hair back and took a deep breath. The air smelled piney and sweet. "I'm not supposed to enjoy the woods," she thought, her smile slowly fading. Susanna had been taught that the woods were a place of evil. As if mirroring her thoughts, the trees grew thicker, shutting out the sunlight. It became evening dark. Away from civilization, deep in the woods was where the evil one and his followers dwelt, Susanna had been taught. The witches of the village came here to dance their evil dances by moonlight with the evil one and his servants. The evil one and his servants lived deep in the holes in the ground, hidden by scrub and thick shrubs. Susanna believed that if she wandered alone into the darkness of their domain, they might reach up and grab her and pull her down to the netherworlds of the eternal torture and darkness. The air grew cooler. From a low branch just above Susanna's head, a dove uttered a deep-throated moan, cold and sorrowful. Susanna shuddered. "It is so dark, suddenly so cold," she said. "Time to go back." As she turned, she felt strong hands grab her from behind. "The evil one!" she cried. Chapter 2. "Let go of me!" Susanna screamed. To her surprise, the hands obediently released her. She spun around, her blue eyes wide with fright, and stared into the laughing face of Edward Fear. "Do I look like the evil one to you?" he asked. Susanna felt her face redden. She glared angrily at him. "Yes, you must be the evil one," she said. "Why else would you be out in these woods?" "I followed you," he replied, his expression solemn. Edward was tall and good-looking. He wore a wide-brimmed black hat over his straight, dark brown hair, which fell below his ears. His gray doublet was made of the finest linen. The cuffs at the end of his sleeves were white and stiffly starched. His navy blue breeches ended just below the knee. Gray wool stockings covered his legs. On his feet were Dutch-style clogs, fashioned of dark leather. No other young man in the village dressed as well as Edward. He seemed to take his clothes as seriously as he did everything else in his life. In private, some villagers criticized his fancy dress, accusing him of the sin of pride. but no one dared criticize him in public, for Edward was a Fear, Benjamin Fear's son, and no one would dare say a word against Magistrate Fear or his son. As the trees shuddered around them in a sudden cold breeze, Edward's dark brown eyes locked on Susanna's. "We should not joke about the Evil One," he said, lowering his voice. "My father says the Evil One's slaves have overrun our village." I'm so afraid these days," Susanna confessed, lowering her gaze to the dark ground. "I keep dreaming about Faith Warburton. She was my friend," Susanna stammered. "I know," Edward muttered softly. "They seized her as a witch because she wore a red ribbon in her hair. They burned her." Susanna's words were cut short by a sob. Edward placed a hand on Susanna's trembling shoulder. "I know that my father must have had proof of your friend's evil practices. He appears stern, but he is a fair and just man, Susanna. We should not be here together. We have to stop our secret meetings. They put me in great danger," Susanna said softly. "You are in no danger," Edward replied. "I wanted to talk to you, Susanna. I wanted to—" Before Susanna could back away, Edward had his arms around her waist. He lowered his face to hers and kissed her. The hat tumbled off his head, and he pressed his lips against hers, urgently, hungrily. Susanna was breathless when she finally pulled free. "You are suffocating me!" she exclaimed, grinning at him. She raised a hand to his shoulder. "What if the Evil One is watching us?" she teased. To her surprise, he pulled away from her touch. His dark eyes flared with anger. "I told you," he warned. "Do not joke about the Evil One." "But Edward," she began. His intensity always startled her. "You know I cannot bear blasphemy," he interrupted in a low, steady voice. They had been meeting secretly for weeks, stealing moments behind the grain barn or behind the trees at the river bank. Susanna had been surprised by Edward's seriousness, by his solemn attitude about most things. She liked to tease him, but quickly learned he didn't share her sense of humor. Why did she care so much about him? Why did she think about him day and night? Why did she dream about being with him forever? Because he needed her. Because he seemed to feel as she did. She gazed at him coyly. "Being here alone together in the woods, that is a crime against our village custom," she said. "What do you think your father would say?" He picked up his hat from the ground, gripping it tightly in one hand. "Being here with you, Susanna, is no crime." "And why is that?" she teased. He hesitated, gazing at her as if trying to see inside her head, to read her thoughts. "Because we love each other," he said, finally, and before she knew it, they were wrapped in each other's arms again. "I want to stay here," Susanna thought happily. "Stay here with Edward in the dark woods. Live in the wild together, just the two of us, away from the village, away from everyone." She pressed her cheeks against his, surprised that his face was as hot as hers. A sudden voice made her cry out and pull away. "Voices! Edward, someone else is here!" she cried, raising her hands to her cheeks in horror. "We're caught!" Chapter 3. Edward's dark eyes grew wide with fear. He grasped Susanna's hand tightly. They listened, frozen together in the dark woods, as if they'd been turned to stone. The voices rose, carried by the wind. Chanting voices. "Burn the witch! Burn the witch! Burn the witch!" "Oh!" Susanna gasped. The chanting voices weren't coming from nearby. The wind was carrying the sound from the commons. "There's no one here," Edward said, smiling with relief. "Poor Abigail Hopping," Susanna whispered. "If she is a witch, she must face the fire," Edward replied, still holding Susanna's hand. Susanna rested her head against his shoulder. "We should go back. I went out for firewood. I should have been home. My mother will think the Evil One has taken me." "You go first," he told her. "I will wait here for a while before I return." "Are you going to tell your father about us?" Susanna asked eagerly. "Yes," Edward told her, "when the time is right." She leaned forward and kissed him again. She didn't want to leave. She didn't want to go back to her tiny, dark house. She didn't want to return to all the anger and fear of the village. Edward gave her a gentle push, his hands on her shoulders. "Go." She forced a smile, then turned and ran off, pulling on the cap and covering her hair. "We're going to be married," she thought, her heart pounding. "Edward and I are going to be married. I am going to be the wife of Edward Fear." She felt as if she was floating through the trees. Susanna ran right past the woodpile and through the commons, and was nearly home before she remembered she had come out for firewood and had to go back. "The carrots are small but sweet," William Good said. He sat stiffly at the head of the table, rubbing gravy off the wooden plate with a biscuit. Susanna watched her father eat his dinner. He looked tired to her, tired and old. He was not yet 40, yet his face was lined and his once blonde hair had turned prematurely white. "Susanna baked the biscuits," Martha Good said. "Would you like more gravy, father?" Susanna asked, gesturing to the gravy pot, still simmering on the hearth. "There are more carrots, too." "I am going to mash some carrots and give them to George when he wakes up," Susanna's mother said. "I do not know why our carrots are so small," Mr. Good grumbled. "Matthew Fear's carrots are as long as candles." "Why do you not ask him for his secret? Why do you not ask him for his secret?" Susanna's mother suggested. William Good scowled. He narrowed his gray-green eyes at his wife. "Matthew Fear has no farming skills that I do not have. He has no secrets that I—" "The Fears have plenty of secrets," his wife interrupted. "Who are they, these Fear brothers? Where did they come from? They do not come to the New World from England, as we did." "I do not know," Mr. Good replied thoughtfully. "They come from a small farm village. That is all I know. They were poor when they arrived, both Fear brothers and their wives. But they have prospered here, and that proves they are pious folk, favored by the Maker." His wife sighed. "These carrots are sweet enough, William. I did not intend to hurt your feelings." William Good frowned. "Sweet enough," he muttered. "Help me clear the dinner table, Susanna," Martha Good ordered. "Why are you sitting there with that dazed, faraway expression on your face?" "Sorry, Mother." Susanna started to get up, but her father placed a hand on her arm to restrain her. "Susanna will clear the table in a little while," he told his wife. "I wish to speak with her first." He stood up, pulled a clay pipe down from his pipe rack, filled it with tobacco from his cloth pouch, and went over to the fire to light it. Susanna turned in her chair, her eyes trained on her father, trying to read his expression. "What did you wish to speak to me about, father?" "About Edward Fear," he replied, frowning as he puffed hard to start the tobacco burning. Susanna gasped. She had never discussed Edward with either of her parents. She and Edward were merely acquaintances, as far as her parents knew. Holding the long white pipe by the bowl, Mr. Good made his way back to the dinner table. He pulled back the stool next to Susanna's and sat down, stiffly. "What about him?" Susanna stammered, clasping her hands tightly in her lap. Her father leaned close to her. Pipe smoke rose from up in front of him, encircling them both in a fragrant cloud. "You and Edward Fear have been seen walking together," he accused. "Walking together without a chaperone present." Susanna's mouth dropped open. She took a deep breath, then started to speak, but no sound came out. "Do you deny it, daughter?" His white eyebrows arched over his gray-green eyes, which burned accusations into hers. "Do you deny it?" "No, father," Susanna replied softly. "You were seen in the woods together." He held the pipe close to his face, but didn't smoke it. "Yes, father," Susanna muttered, her heart thudding in her chest. Then the words burst out of her. She had been longing to tell her parents. Now she could hold back the news no longer. "Edward and I are in love," she cried. "He wants to marry me. Is that not wonderful?" Her mother turned from the hearth, her eyes wide with surprise. William Good's face reddened. He lowered his pipe to the table. Daughter, have you lost your senses? Are you living in a world of dreams? Susanna gaped at him. Didn't you hear me, father? Edward wants to marry me. Her father shut his eyes. He cleared his throat loudly. The pipe trembled in his hand. You cannot marry Edward Fear, he said quietly. What are you saying? Susanna whispered. Why can't I? Because Edward Fear is already betrothed, Mr. Good replied flatly. Susanna gasped. What? Edward Fear is engaged to be married, her father said. Edward is to marry a young woman of Portsmouth. His father told me this morning. Chapter 4. The hearth fire flickered low. Long shadows slipped across the floor. In her sleeping alcove, huddled under an old feather quilt, Susanna turned her face to the wall. How could Edward be so cruel? She asked herself for the 1,000th time. How could he leave me to believe that he cared for me, that he loved me? Susanna pressed her face into the pillow to muffle her sobs. She had gone to bed early, hoping her parents wouldn't see how upset she was. Hours had passed. A pale half-moon was high in the late-night sky, and Susanna was still wide awake, still tossing in her narrow bed, crying softly, and thinking about Edward with anger and disbelief. I trusted Edward, she thought. I believed everything he said. I risked my reputation for him. And all the while he was engaged to another girl. Breathing hard, Susanna rolled over and stared at the glowing embers in the fireplace across the room. Her secret meetings with Edward Fear rolled through her mind. She remembered his words, his touch, his kiss. Edward always seemed trustworthy, she thought miserably. So honest and upright. So good. Susanna kicked off the quilt and pushed at the pillow, punching it with both hands. I will never trust anyone again, she told herself bitterly. Never! Across the commons, firelight blazed in the windows of Benjamin Fear's 2-story house. In the dining room, Benjamin was standing at one end of the oak table, gripping the back of a hand-carved chair. Benjamin's son, Edward, glared at him defiantly from the other end of the table. Benjamin was big and broad-shouldered, an imposing man who looked as if he could wrestle a bull, and win. He had straight black hair that fell below his ears, and bushy black eyebrows over small, dark eyes that seemed to be able to pierce through anything. Benjamin's face was red, and almost always set in a hard frown. He was so powerful in appearance, his expression so angry, that most people in Wickham were afraid of him, which didn't displease him in the slightest. Standing with his back to the fire, Benjamin unfastened the long row of brass buttons down the front of his black doublet, his dark eyes studying Edward. I will not obey you, father, Edward insisted, his voice trembling. He had never defied his father. He knew it was wrong. Benjamin stared across the table, his features set. He didn't reply. I cannot obey you, father, Edward said when his father did not reply. I will not marry Anne Ward. Edward gripped the back of the chair. He hoped his father could not see his trembling knees. You will marry the girl in the autumn, Benjamin said in his deep baritone. I have arranged the marriage with her father. He turned away from Edward to indicate that the discussion had ended. Picking up a poker, he jabbed at the logs in the fireplace, sending a shower of sparks flying up the brick chimney. Edward swallowed hard. Can I do this? He asked himself. Can I stand up to my father? Am I strong enough? Another question nagged at Edward as he struggled to find the words. Is it right to argue with my father? Is it not my duty to obey his wishes? No, Edward answered his own question. I love Susanna Good. I will marry Susanna and no one else. I cannot obey my father's wishes this time. I will not. Edward took a deep breath. Sir, he called, causing Benjamin to turn away from the fire. "I cannot marry Anne Ward. I do not know her. She is a stranger." "You will become acquainted with her after the wedding," Benjamin said sternly. "It is a very fortunate arrangement for us." "It is not fortunate for me," Edward declared heartedly. "Do not raise your voice to me, Edward," Benjamin warned, his face a dark crimson. He raised the fireplace poker and pointed it at his son. "Anne Ward is an excellent match for you." "But I do not know her, father. I do not love her," Edward cried shrilly. "Love?" Benjamin tossed back his head and laughed. "Edward, we did not come to these colonies for love. My brother Matthew and I did not leave our village for love. We came here to succeed. We came here to escape the poverty of our lives, to escape it forever." "I know, father," Edward said, sighing, "but
do you know how poor our family was in the old country?"
Benjamin demanded, setting down the heavy iron poker and returning to the table. His eyes burned into Edward's, hotter than the fireplace flames.
"Do you know how poor Matthew and I were? We ate rats to survive, Edward."
"I know, sir." Edward tried to interrupt. He had heard this speech before.
"Many was the nights we huddled together to keep warm," Benjamin continued. "We had no fire, no blankets."
Edward lowered his gaze to the floor. He held his breath, waiting for his chance to speak.
"We came to the New World to succeed, Edward. Not to succeed, but to prosper."
"You have done well, sir," Edward broke in. "You are the respected magistrate of Wickham, and Uncle Matthew's farm is the most—"
"We can do better,"
Benjamin exploded, slamming his fist on the table.
"Your marriage to Anne Ward will help us do better, Edward."
"Why, father? I don't see—"
"August Ward is a tea importer for Portsmouth," Benjamin explained, lowering his voice. "It has made him a very wealthy man. As his son-in-law, you will become a tea importer too. You will share in his wealth."
"No, father," Edward shook his head. "I cannot. I will not."
"You will," his father insisted sternly. "You must. You must marry August Ward's daughter."
"I cannot, father. I am in love with someone else." The words burst out from Edward's mouth. Before he could stop them, he gasped, realizing what he had revealed. For a brief moment, Benjamin's eyes widened with surprise. Then his expression quickly darkened.
"In love?" he asked, his voice rising sarcastically. "With whom?"
He made his way down the long table to confront his son.
"With whom?"
he demanded again, bringing his face a few inches from Edward's. "Susanna Good," Edward replied weakly. He cleared his throat and tried to avoid his father's harsh stare. Benjamin hesitated, stunned. Then he closed his eyes and began to laugh. Scornful laughter. "Do not laugh, sir," Edward stammered. "I am in love with Susanna Good, and I will marry her." Benjamin Fear shook his head, his smile lingering.
"William Good owns 2 scrawny chickens and 2 cows. His daughter is not a match for you. My son."
Edward took a deep breath, trying to calm his pounding heart. In his 17 years, he had never argued with his father, never dared to disagree with him. "Please," he prayed silently, "give me the strength to stand up to my father now. I know I am right. I know I cannot betray Susanna. Please give me the strength." "Sir," Edward began, "Susanna is a pious girl. She is the girl I will marry. I cannot marry a girl for her wealth. I must marry for love." Benjamin closed his eyes. A log crackled loudly in the fireplace. The floorboards creaked as Benjamin shifted his weight. He sighed wearily.
"Your engagement to Anne Ward is arranged. We will travel to Portsmouth in the autumn for your wedding. I wish your mother Margaret, bless her soul, were alive to see you wed so profitably."
"No!" Edward cried. "No, father!" He could feel his anger rise, feel the heat of it in his chest, feel himself losing control for the first time in his life.
I have always obeyed you, sir. I know you are a wise and honorable man, but it is my life, Edward screamed, his hands balled into tight fists at his waist. It is my life, and I will marry Susanna Good. I will marry her, even if we have to run away to do it. Edward turned from his father and ran from the room. I did it, he thought, relief mixed with his anger as he made his way to the bedroom. I said what I had to say. I stood up to my father. Back in the narrow dining room, Benjamin Fear slumped heavily into a chair. He fingered the shiny buttons of his doublet as he stared thoughtfully into the fire. Before long, a dark smile spread over the man's ruddy face. I am sorry, Edward, my poor, confused son, he said, grinning into the leaping flames. You will never marry Susanna Good. Chapter 5. I dislike peeling potatoes, Susanna groaned. Her mother, seated in front of the hearth with the baby on her lap, raised her eyes to Susanna, her features tight with concern. Are you feeling well, daughter? It isn't in your nature to complain. I'm feeling well, Susanna replied, sighing. I shall never feel well again, she thought miserably. Never, never, never. She wanted to tell her mother everything, tell her about Edward, and how he had lied to her, how he had betrayed her. But Susanna knew she had to keep her broken heart a secret. Her meetings with Edward were against all rules of conduct. Susanna had sinned, and now she was paying for her sins. Paying with an empty feeling that gnawed at her without relief. Paying with a heavy sadness she knew she'd never shake. Martha Good rose from her chair, cradling the sleeping baby in one arm, and stepped up behind Susanna at the table. She put her hand on Susanna's forehead. You do feel a little warm, daughter. Do you feel feverish? Susanna lowered her knife and gazed up at her mother. I am not ill, she said impatiently. I just detest peeling potatoes. They are so wet and slippery. Martha Good took a step back, startled by Susanna's vehemence. We should all be thankful that we have been given potatoes for our meal, she said softly. Your father works so hard, Susanna. It is a sin to complain if there is food on the table. Yes, mother, Susanna relented, lowering her eyes. Edward's face flashed in her mind, his thick brown hair, his dark eyes. Where are you now, Edward? Susanna wondered, picking up another potato to peel. What are you doing? I know you're not thinking about me. Are you thinking about your bride? Are you packing your bags, preparing for your journey to Portsmouth? She uttered a long sigh and stabbed the knife blade into the potato. Susanna, are you sure you are not ill? Her mother demanded. No, not ill. The potatoes can wait, her mother said, returning to the hearth-side chair and carefully lowering the baby onto her lap. It is a beautiful afternoon. Put on your cap and step outside. Breathe some fresh air. It will refresh you, daughter. I do not feel like breathing fresh air, Susanna snapped. I might see Edward, she thought, her heart skipping a beat at the idea. And what would I do if I saw him again? What would I say? She could feel her face redden in shame. I was such a fool. Struggling to hold back the tears, Susanna picked up another potato. The door burst open without warning. Susanna and her mother both cried out in surprise as two village men stepped into the room, grim expressions on their face. What? Martha Good started, but her voice caught in her throat. The baby opened his eyes and gazed up at her, startled. The two men stepped to the center of the room, revealing Benjamin Fear in the open doorway. My husband is not home, Martha Good told the two officers. I believe he is at the Commons. The two men stood stiffly, their expressions set, as Benjamin Fear strode into the room. His black boots clonked heavily on the floorboards, his face red beneath his tall black hat. We are not here for your husband, Martha Good, he
he said coldly in his booming baritone. I do not understand, she replied, alarm creeping into her voice. The baby uttered a squawk, preparing to cry. Martha Good pulled him close to her chest. What business have you with me, Magistrate Fear? She asked, climbing reluctantly to her feet. Benjamin Fear ignored her question.
Keep watch on them,
he instructed the two men.
I will search for the proof.
Proof? Proof of what? Susanna cried, tossing down her knife and jumping to her feet. Why are you here? Why can you not wait for my father to return? Benjamin ignored Susanna too. He strode quickly to the hearth, his black cloak sweeping behind him. Aha! He bent down as if picking up something from behind the kettle. When he turned around to face them, Benjamin held a purple cloth bag in one hand. His lips spread into an unpleasant smile.
I believe we have the proof we need.
Proof of what? Susanna demanded shrilly. Benjamin walked quickly to the table and overturned the bag, spilling its contents onto the tabletop. To her astonishment, Susanna saw a chicken's foot, some feathers, dried roots of some kind, a small bone, and a glass vial containing a blood-colored liquid. What is that? Susanna cried. That does not belong to us, her mother cried, her face pale, her troubled eyes darting from the items on the table to Benjamin Fear.
We have the proof we need,
Benjamin told his men, holding up the empty bag. He gestured to Susanna and her mother.
Take them to the prison. Tie them securely to await trial.
Trial? Martha Good shrieked, holding her baby tightly against her chest. Trial for what crime?
For the crime of witchcraft,
Benjamin Fear declared, eyeing Susanna coldly. The two officers moved quickly, grabbing Susanna and her mother firmly by the shoulders. Benjamin strode quickly to the door, still gripping the empty purple bag. Benjamin Fear, you know us! Martha Good cried desperately. You know we are a God-fearing, humble, and pious family. You cannot do this to us! Susanna shrieked, fear choking her throat. You cannot do this to us! The officers dragged Susanna and her mother to the door. The baby whimpered in confused fear, one tiny pink hand breaking free of his mother's grasp and thrashing the air wildly. As Susanna and her mother were pulled out the door, Benjamin Fear stepped back to watch. His eyes gazed hard at Martha Good, then lingered for a while on Susanna. He didn't smile. His face was set in rigid coldness. But Susanna thought she caught a gleam of merriment in his dark eyes. Just then, the neighbor, Mary Halsey, attracted by the commotion, appeared at the door. Please, take the child, Martha pleaded and handed the baby to Mary. Keep him safe. The baby's whimpers turned to frightened cries. As the two men dragged Susanna and her mother away, Benjamin Fear followed close behind, his eyes on Susanna all the while. This is not happening, Susanna thought, her heart pounding, the blood pulsing at her temples. This cannot be happening to us. She heard surprised murmurs as they passed through the commons, whispered questions, muffled cries of surprise. The prison loomed ahead, a low clapboard building behind the meeting house. Why are you doing this to us? Susanna cried, the words bursting from her throat. Why are you dragging us from our home? Benjamin Fear stopped on the path. His voice was low and steady. His eyes locked on Susanna's.
You two witches will burn before the week is out,
he said. Chapter 6. Torches were hung on the meeting house walls. Their flames flickered and threatened to go out every time the door was pulled open, allowing a gust of wind into the hot room. In the prisoner's box at the front of the court, Susanna gripped her mother's hand and stared at the flames. Her mother's hand felt so small, like that of a cold, frightened animal. Without realizing it, Susanna had nervously started chewing her lower lip. Now she felt the bitter taste of blood in her mouth. They burn witches, she thought, staring at the torchlight. They've burned 3 already. Her entire body convulsed in a shudder of fear. She squeezed her mother's hand tighter. Even though witches in other parts of Massachusetts colony were hanged, Benjamin Fear believed that burning was the only way to punish a witch. But I am not a witch. Surely if there is justice in Wickham, I will not be found guilty. The long, low-ceilinged room was filled with shadows. Solemn faces flickered in the orange torchlight. Eyes, dozens of eyes, peered at Susanna and her mother. The rows of wooden benches stretched to the back of the long room. People crowded quietly into them, the frightened citizens of the town, whispering their fears, staring at Susanna and her mother with curiosity and surprise and pity. The whispers and hushed voices grew louder until Susanna wanted to cover her ears. "Mother, why did they stare at us like that?" she uttered in a frightened voice, leaning so close she could feel her mother's trembling. "They know us. They know who we are. Some believe they are staring into the faces of evil," Martha Good replied, squeezing her daughter's hand. "But they know us," Susanna repeated shrilly, her heart thudding in her chest. "Our innocence will soon free us," her mother replied softly. Her words were brave, but her entire body shook with fear. "Edward, where are you?" Susanna wondered. "Have you spoken to your father? Have you told him about us?" "Edward will not let us burn," Susanna said out loud without realizing it. Her mother stared at her in surprise. "What did you say?" Susanna started to reply, but someone in a front bench cried out loudly. Susanna heard a flapping sound and felt a cold ripple of wind close to her ear. Startled voices cried out. Susanna heard the flapping again, like the beating of wings. A shadowy form darted overhead. "A bat!" a man cried from the back of the room. The creature swooped low toward the flickering light of a torch, then flew over the prisoner's box again, its wings beating like a frightened heart. Matthew Fear appeared at the front of the room. "Open the door. Let it out," he ordered. The bat swung low over the spectators, and Susanna saw several heads duck. She felt a cold ripple of air as the bat flew past her face. "Hold open the door and it will fly out," Matthew Fear said in his high-pitched voice. The doors were obediently pulled open. The torches flickered and bent in the invading breeze. A moment later, the bat swooped out, disappearing into the starless sky. The doors were closed. Matthew Fear shouted over the buzz of voices, calling for silence. He served as trial warden, keeping order during his brother's trial proceedings. He did not have Benjamin's booming, deep voice. He was not as large or imposing as his brother, but he had the same fire of ambition in his dark eyes. The room grew silent. The shuffling of feet made the floorboards creak. Someone near the doors coughed loudly. Matthew turned to the prisoner, adjusting the white stock he wore over his robe. "You may summon as many evil creatures as you wish," he told Susanna and her mother, his eyes glowing like dark coals. "You may summon bats or snakes or the evil one himself, but it will only serve to prove your guilt." "We did not summon that bat!" Susanna cried. "Silence!" Matthew ordered. "Silence! A dark creature like that would not enter our court unless summoned." Low murmurs burst forth from the row of benches. Accusing eyes, reflecting the torchlight, glared at Susanna and her mother. "Silence! Silence!" Matthew shouted, gesturing with both hands. As the room grew quiet, Susanna saw a man at the end of a row rise to his feet. "Release my wife and daughter," he demanded. It is father, Susanna cried to her mother, leaning forward to see him better.
Release them, Matthew Fear. You know they are not witches, Mr. Good cried passionately.
A tall man in dark robes strode to the front of the room and stood beside Matthew Fear.
Be seated, William Good, Benjamin Fear ordered. We do not place innocent women on trial here.
But they are innocent, William declared. I swear it by all that is holy.
Be seated, Benjamin commanded in his booming voice. Be seated, William, or I will remove you from this court.
Susanna saw her father open his mouth to protest, but he uttered only a helpless groan before slumping onto the seat. Benjamin Fear turned to face the accused. His straight black hair and dark eyes glowed almost red in the torchlight.
Martha Good, do you wish to confess your guilt?
He asked, leaning close to the prisoner's box. Susanna's mother cleared her throat. Her voice came out in a choked whisper. I have no guilt to confess. Sneering, Benjamin turned his harsh gaze to Susanna.
Susanna Good, do you wish to confess your guilt?
Susanna clasped her trembling hands tightly in her lap and lowered her head, a couple of blonde ringlets falling loose from her cap over her face. I am not a witch, she managed to mutter. Edward, where are you? Edward, aren't you going to save us? Isn't anyone going to save us?
Confess now, Benjamin demanded. There are witnesses in this hall tonight. Witnesses who saw you both dancing with the evil one in the moonlit woods.
That is not true, Susanna shrieked, on her feet now. Susanna! She couldn't hear her mother's warning, feel her mother's touch on her sleeve. This is not true, Susanna repeated. We have never... Be silent, witch, Matthew Fear commanded, stepping up beside his brother, a fierce scowl on his slender face. You have already tried to bedevil us by summoning the creature of the night into our meeting hall. Do not disrupt our trial again.
Confess now, Benjamin urged. Your hollow protests only serve to demonstrate your guilt.
But we are innocent, Susanna shrieked.
Release them! Release them now! Susanna heard her father cry.
Low murmurs spread through the long rows of benches, growing to a roar.
Release my innocent wife and child, William Good cried desperately. My son needs his mother.
Matthew turned to point to Susanna's father, who stood with his hat gripped tightly in one hand. Remove him from the hall, he shouted angrily. Suddenly, John Halsey, Mary Halsey's husband, stood in the back of the meeting house. Let him speak, Matthew. You've known the Good family for years, he cried.
Release my family, William insisted. This trial is a mistake, a mockery.
Remove him, Matthew ordered, silencing John Halsey. From out of the shadows, two militia officers moved quickly, pushing their way into William's row, grabbing him by the shoulders. Staring over at the startled, silent faces of the onlookers, Susanna saw her father struggle. She heard angry shouts, scuffling. A hard blow, followed by her father's cry of pain. A few moments later, she could see her father's limp body being dragged up the aisle. The doors at the back were flung open. The sudden breeze threatened to extinguish the torches against the walls. The flames dipped low. The darkness deepened. Then the flames rose up again. The room returned to heavy silence. Her father had been taken out. You cannot save us, father, Susanna thought, cold dread tightening her throat. You cannot save us, so who will? Will it be you, Edward? Are you here? Will you speak to your father? Will you rescue us from the fire? Or have you betrayed me again?
We have all witnessed their dark powers,
Benjamin Fear announced to the rows of onlookers.
We have seen them try to darken this hall just now. The torches nearly went out, but our goodness prevailed over their evil power.
He turned to Susanna and her mother.
Your evil could not douse our torches. Your evil could not put out the light of truth in this room.
It was the wind that nearly doused the torches, Susanna cried.
Silence, witch!
Benjamin screamed, his booming voice ringing off the dark wood walls. He raised one hand high above his head. Susanna saw that his hand was gripping the purple bag, bulging with its odd assortment of items.
I found the proof of your blasphemy,
Benjamin declared.
I myself found the tools of your witchcraft. I found this near your hearth, a hearth made cold by the presence of the evil one.
It does not belong to us, Susanna screamed, feeling her mother's restraining hand on her sleeve once again.
Silence,
Benjamin warned, his dark eyes narrowing at Susanna.
We have the proof of your evil practices,
Benjamin continued.
We have witnesses who have seen your moonlight dance with the evil one and his servants. And we have seen your attempts to frighten us tonight by bringing a bat into our meeting hall and trying to douse our light.
No! Susanna shrieked, tugging at the sides of her hair with both hands. No! No!
Good shall always triumph,
Benjamin continued, ignoring Susanna's shrill cries of protest.
Good shall always triumph over the evil one. Those of us with pure hearts shall always triumph over your kind, Martha and Susanna Good.
Susanna's mother lowered her head, but Susanna could see her shoulders trembling and knew her mother was crying. Susanna wanted to scream out her protest, to declare her innocence until Benjamin Fear would listen to her, but she could see that her shouts were of no use. Her heart pounding, her head spinning, Susanna slumped over and leaned her head against her mother's trembling shoulder.
A dark evil has descended on Wickham,
Benjamin Fear was saying.
As magistrate, it is my duty to battle it whenever it may appear.
He faced the onlookers and lowered his voice as he spoke to them.
It is not my desire to put on trial the wives and daughters of our village, but it is my sacred duty to protect all who are innocent from those possessed by the evil one, such as these.
He pointed to Susanna and her mother.
There is nothing left but for you to confess,
he demanded, stepping up before the prisoner's box.
Do you confess, Mistress Good? Do you confess to your evil practices?
Susanna's mother was crying, too hard to reply, her shoulders heaving, her face turned away into the shadows.
Do you confess to practicing the dark arts, Susanna Good?
Benjamin demanded. I am innocent, Susanna uttered in a choked whisper.
Your refusal to confess, Benjamin shouted, your unwillingness to confess to the truth proves your guilt.
He stood over Susanna and her mother, leaning close, so close that Susanna could smell his sour breath.
We have found you, Martha Good, and you, Susanna Good, guilty of witchcraft. It is my duty as magistrate to sentence you both.
No, please, Susanna shrieked, reaching out to him. He backed away, eyeing her coldly, his face half hidden in shadow.
You both shall burn tomorrow night,
Benjamin announced, without any emotion at all. A pale half-moon poking through wisps of dark cloud cast a faint rectangle of light through the tiny window of the prison cell. Susanna leaned against the cold wall and stared down the patch of light on the dirt floor. Her hands were tied behind her, so she could do no witchery, the warden at the jail had told her. Martha Good lay in darkness against the opposite wall. Breathing hard, uttering low moans, calling out for her baby, she slept fitfully. Too frightened and upset to sleep, Susanna suddenly saw a shadow making its way up the front of her skirt. A spider. She bent toward it, struggling to free her hands, but they were fastened tightly. She could not brush the spider away. She could only stare at it helplessly as it made its way up her dress. Outside, the white moonlight fell on two large mounds of straw, golden under the pale wash of light. Is this the straw we will burn in? Susanna thought with a shudder. Are these mounds of straw waiting to be our final bed? The spider was up to her waist, its legs moving quickly over the coarse fabric of the dress. As she stared at the mounds of straw and pictured them afire, a strangled sob burst from her throat. She turned her eyes from the window. "I am not a witch," she thought with fierce bitterness. "My mother is not a witch." What of the 3 who have already burned? Were they innocent too? Are the innocent burning in Wickham? Can that be true? Suddenly, the moonlight appeared to be snuffed out. The tiny cell was cast in deep darkness. Startled, Susanna turned to see a silhouette on the other side of the window, blocking the light. Who's there?" she stammered. "Susanna?" came a hoarse whisper. "Edward!" she cried, feeling a burst of joy lighten her chest. "Edward! Have you come to save us?" Chapter 7. Edward Fear stared at her, his face half hidden in darkness. "Have you come to save us?" Susanna repeated in an eager whisper. Edward hesitated. Susanna could see his dark eyes staring in at her, studying her coldly. "Save you? Why would I save you?" he demanded finally, his voice as cold as his eyes. "Edward, I thought—" "How could you betray me like this?" Edward asked, spitting the words angrily. Susanna gasped. "Betray you? I did nothing to betray you. You betrayed me. You toyed with my heart. You were engaged to be married, and yet you continue to—" "I was never engaged," Edward insisted vehemently in a low whisper. He pulled back from the window and glanced quickly from side to side. When he was certain there was no one around, he pressed his face close to the opening again. "I was never engaged. I told my father that I was in love with you," Edward told her bitterly. Susanna swallowed hard. "You did? But you betrayed me, Susanna." "No, I never—" Susanna started. "You betrayed me with the evil one," Edward accused, his dark eyes glowing with anger. "No, I am innocent, Edward," Susanna whispered fiercely. "You must believe me. You must." "You cannot be innocent," Edward whispered. "You are a witch, Susanna. You tried to lead me astray, but your evil was exposed in time." "No, I am innocent," Susanna declared. "Edward, you know me. We have been so close. We have meant so much to each other. How—" Her voice caught in her throat. She took a deep breath and tried again. "How could you be so certain of my guilt?" He stared at her, his features set, his eyes as cold as his words. "I told you, Susanna. I revealed my feelings about you to my father. I told my father of my love for you. Do you think that knowing this, my father would put you on trial if you were innocent? But Edward, do you think my father would put me through this pain? Do you think my father would hurt me like this? Deliberately hurt me by trying an innocent girl?" Edward shook his head, his eyes still burning accusations into Susanna's. "No, Susanna," he said softly. "My father may be stern and hard, but he always does what is right. He is a good man. My father cares about me, about my feelings. He would never do this to me. He would never put you on trial unless he was certain of your guilt." "I swear to you, Edward," Susanna started. "But he wouldn't," let her finish. "To think that I defied my father on your behalf," Edward cried. "To think that I went against my father's wishes in order to stand up for you. To think that I risked my father's goodwill. My father, who is a good and pious man, who only wants the best for me. To think that I was ready to defy him for you, a witch." "Edward, your father is wrong," Susanna shouted desperately. His eyes narrowed. He lowered his voice to an icy whisper. "Do not speak of my father, witch. Your spell over me is ended." "Edward, no! Edward, please!" Susanna wailed. The face in the window was gone. The pale moonlight returned. Susanna sobbed quietly. Across the room, her mother stirred, but didn't awaken. Susanna felt the spider inching along her neck now. Her skin tingled as it made a path up to her chin. Go ahead, spider. Bite, she thought with a bitter sigh of defeat. Go ahead and bite. Across the village in the Goods' small house, William Good sat hunched in a tall back chair. The fire had burned low, purple embers sizzling quietly. The room grew cold. William, staring blankly at the darkening hearth, didn't notice. Deep in despair, he had been sitting motionless for more than an hour, unable to focus his eyes, unable to focus his mind. The sounds of the trial, the shadowy faces, and their accusing eyes all washed across his distressed mind. All is lost, he thought, picturing his wife and daughter, picturing them at home by the fire, picturing them in the peace and tranquility that would never return. Even his baby was lost to him. A neighbor had George for the time being. All is lost. When a knock came at the door, William didn't move. Sinking deeper and deeper into his despair, he didn't hear it. The knock repeated, and then again, even more loudly, a third time. William stirred, raised his head, and listened. Yes, a knock on the door. Who could it be at this hour? Who would have the nerve to come to his door, knowing how he must be suffering at this moment, knowing how he would suffer the rest of his life, how this night would be played out again and again in his mind until the day he died. The loud knocking was repeated. Someone was being very insistent. With a groan, William pulled himself unsteadily to his feet. The purple embers came into focus. The fire is dying, he thought. Everything in my life is dying. More loud knocking. Go away, William muttered. But he made his way to the door and pulled it open. The bright light of a torch caused William to shield his eyes. Slowly, the face of the torchbearer came into focus. Matthew Fear? What do you want of me? William demanded weakly. Have you come to take me away too? Chapter 8. The torchlight fell over Matthew Fear's face, casting it into deep shadow. His dark eyes stared out at William, black circles ringed by black as the grave. I have come to help you, not accuse you, William, Matthew said softly. He raised the torch high, and once again his face disappeared under the shadow of his hat. Help me? William asked weakly, his body sagging in the narrow doorway. May I come in? William nodded and took a step back. Matthew Fear set the torch down in the dirt and edged into the house, pulling his cloak around him. He removed his hat, revealing tousled brown hair. He hung the hat on the hook on the wall. The two men stood awkwardly in the front of the door, staring at each other. William was the first to break the silence. My wife and daughter have been unjustly accused. Your brother has made a dreadful mistake. Martha and Susanna know nothing of the dark arts. Matthew started to move past William, his eyes on the dying fire. But William grabbed the front of his cloak. Your brother is wrong, he cried. He is wrong. Wrong! My brother is human, Matthew said softly. He pulled away from William's grasp and, straightening the front of his cloak, stepped to the fire. William stared after him, bewildered by his remark. Matthew picked up a log from beside the fireplace and dropped it onto the dying embers. You let your fire die, William, he said, staring into the hearth. I do not care about fires now, William replied, his trembling voice revealing his emotion. I care only about my wife and daughter. I implore you, Matthew. Matthew turned to face William, clasping his hands in front of his gray doublet. He had rough hands, William saw, farmer's hands. I believe I can help you, William, Matthew said softly. You mean, I believe I can save your wife and daughter. William uttered a loud sigh. He gestured to the straight-backed chair near the fire. Matthew shook his head. He began to pace back and forth in front of the hearth, his boots clicking against the floorboards. My brother is human, as I sent. William scratched his white hair. I do not understand. Do you mean to say... His voice trailed off. I have influence with Benjamin, Matthew said, raising his dark eyes to William's. You can talk to him? William asked eagerly. You can reason with him? You can explain that he has made a tragic error? A strange smile formed on Matthew's face. He stopped pacing and nodded. I believe I can persuade my brother to change the verdict. Your wife and daughter need not to burn tomorrow evening. Oh, thank you, Matthew, William cried joyfully. He dropped to his knees and bowed his head in a silent prayer. When he raised his eyes, he saw that Matthew still had a strange smile on his lips. A wave of doubt swept over William as he climbed heavily to his feet. You can really sway your brother? He asked hopefully. Your brother will listen to you? Matthew nodded. Sweeping his cloak around him, he lowered himself into the tall-backed wooden chair. I can persuade Benjamin, he repeated. He narrowed his dark eyes. But it will be costly. What? William wasn't certain he had heard correctly. Was Matthew Fear asking for payment? For a bribe? It will be costly, William, Matthew repeated, his smile fading. My services in this matter must be well rewarded. William Good swallowed hard. I have little money, he choked out, but I will spend every shilling I have to save Martha and Susanna. The price is £100, Matthew announced flatly, staring hard at William. £100? William cried, unable to conceal his surprise. But, Matthew, I beg you! £100 is a small price to pay, Matthew said, rising and walking over to the hearth. The fresh log had just caught flame. Matthew held out his hands to warm them. William gaped at him in disbelief. He was willing to spare Martha and Susanna in exchange for a bribe, William thought. I knew the Fear brothers were ambitious. I knew their characters were weakened by the sin of greed, but I never dreamed they were so corrupt. I never dreamed they would try to increase their wealth by threatening the lives of an innocent woman and girl. Matthew, I have £80, William protested. £80 is all that I brought from England, all that I possess in the world. If you take it, I will have nothing. Matthew's darkened eyes lit up, reflecting the leaping flames in the hearth. You will have your wife and daughter, he said flatly. William lowered his head, knowing he would pay the huge sum to Matthew Fear, knowing he would pay anything to rescue Martha and Susanna from the flame. When he looked up, Matthew was examining a long-handled pan hanging on the wall beside the hearth. Very nice warming pan, he said, taking it down and turning it over in his hands, admiring it. Is it brass? It is the finest brass, William replied. It was craned by my father. I will take it as part of the payment, Matthew announced, still examining it, since you do not have the full £100 to pay me. Take it, William replied with a wave of his hand. Take everything I own, Matthew. Just return my family to me safely. Matthew lowered the warming pan and gazed around the small room. Speaking of your family, where is little George? He asked. Mary Halsey next door has taken the baby, William replied unhappily. He needed a nurse, and I could not bear to look upon him, to see his innocent face and know that he would grow up without ever knowing his mother or sister. A loud sob escaped William's throat. He wiped tears from his eyes. I will get you your payments, Matthew, he said in a voice trembling with emotion. Then will you speak to Benjamin tonight? Matthew nodded solemnly. Your family will be released tomorrow at sunset. Your troubled heart may rest easy, William. His head still spinning, William eagerly made his way to the back of the house, where his life savings were hidden. As he pulled the heavy cloth bag up from under a loose floorboard, he felt as if his heart were about to burst. Martha will be home tomorrow night. Susanna will be home too. We will all be so happy again. What rejoicing we will do. He hoisted the bag to the front of the room and sat down at the table to count it out. 80 pounds, William said, finally shoving the pile of coins towards Matthew. I am left with 2 copper shillings, but I am a rich man. Yes, you are, Matthew agreed, his face completely expressionless. As he leaned forward to collect the coins, the pendant he wore around his neck fell in front of William's eyes. It was so unusual that William couldn't help but comment on it. What an interesting amulet you wear, Matthew, he remarked. Matthew stood up and fingered the amulet, as if seeing it for the first time. The silver disc sparkled with blue jewels. The jewels were grasped by a silver 3-toed claw. Matthew twirled the disc in his fingers. On the back, 3 Latin words were inscribed. William struggled to read the words. Dominatio per malum. Quite unusual, William said. What do the words mean? Matthew tucked the amulet back inside his doublet. Just an old saying, he replied with a shrug. The amulet was given to me by my grandmother before I left our village. I wear it only as a reminder of that wonderful old woman and my previous life, a life of poverty and struggle. William raised his eyes to Matthew's, studying his face in the dim firelight. I have heard such a claw referred to as the demon's claw, he told his visitor. It is said to have powers. For a brief moment, Matthew's mouth remained open in surprise. When he regained his composure, he said, I know nothing about powers or demon's claws. Nor should you, William Good. No, of course not, William said quickly, lowering his eyes. Matthew Fear collected the remaining coins. Then, carrying the brass warming pan, he made his way to the door, his cloak sweeping behind him. He lowered his hat onto his head and turned to gaze back at William. William hadn't risen from the table. His entire body was trembling with joy, with eagerness, with relief. My family, he managed to say. I will make sure of everything, Matthew Fear promised. Then, pulling his heavy cloak closer about him, he opened the door and disappeared into the night. Chapter 9. The next evening, William Good hurried across the commons towards the prison. A small flock of sheep interrupted their grazing to raise their heads and mutter their surprise in his direction. The sun spread rose-colored waves across the evening sky as it lowered itself behind the trees. A pale half-moon was already visible, just poking over the shingled roof of Benjamin Fear's 2-story house. The day had gone by in a haze for William. Mary Halsey had brought him his midday meal, but it had gone untouched. He had intended to mend the fence around his wife's small kitchen garden, but hadn't the strength. Time had stood still, and William Good frozen with it. Only when the sun had begun to sink and evening approached had William sprung to life. Now he moved quickly past squawking chickens and a lowing herd of scrawny cows, eager to be reunited with his beloved family. Eager to hug them, to touch them, eager to share the warm tears that would flow, the happy tears that would wash away the terror, erase all the nightmares. Eager to bring Martha and Susanna home. As the low gray prison building came into view, William's heart began to pound. So much joy, so much relief. Panting loudly with excitement, he slowed his pace. Then he stopped to catch his breath. A yapping hound dog ran across his path. William looked up to see a crowd in front of the prison entrance. They've come to share my joy, he realized. Their faces were hidden from him, hidden by dark hats and hoods. But he knew they were his neighbors, his friends, grateful for the reversal of the unjust verdict, grateful for the good change of fortune. As he approached them, his knees felt weak, his legs trembling. He forced himself to take a deep breath and hold it. He could hear their murmuring voices as they huddled near the prison doorway. "This is the happiest day of my life," he thought. And then the door swung open. An officer appeared. Another officer stepped out in front of the murmuring crowd. Susanna came next, her head lowered as she walked through the doorway. Martha Good followed, close behind, her shadow blue against the hard gray ground. "Susanna! Martha!" William called, pushing eagerly through the crowd of well-wishers. They both raised their eyes and searched for him. "Here I am! Martha! Over here! Susanna!" William called happily. He stepped to the front of the group of onlookers, breathing hard, his face red, his vision already blurred by happy tears. "Martha! Susanna!" He watched for them to be released. But to his surprise, their hands were tied behind their backs. William gasped as one of the officers turned and shoved Martha from behind, pushing her hard, causing her to stumble forward. "Martha!" William cried. She saw him finally and called out to face him. She saw him finally and called out to him, a mournful expression on her face. "Do not worry," he called. "They are releasing you now." "Father!" Susanna cried shrilly, her face also twisted in anguish. "Help us, Father!" "Do not worry," William started, but his voice caught in his throat as he saw the officers force his wife and daughter towards the low mounds of straw. "Father!" Susanna pleaded. "William! William! Help us!" Martha cried. "Wait!" William shouted. Someone tried to restrain him.
"It is all in the hands of the Maker,"
he heard someone mutter.
"Let us pray for their souls."
"No!" William screamed. He pulled away, jerked himself free, and began running towards them. "Stop! Stop!" To William's horror, Susanna and Martha had already been marched to the straw piles and were being tied to tall, wooden stakes. "No!" William's scream of protest raged in the evening air like a howl of a desperate animal. His vision blurred by angry tears, he burst forward, howling in rage. A frantic wail of protest. He stopped short when he saw Benjamin Fear at the edge of the crowd, overseeing the proceedings, hands on the side of his long, black cloak, his face hidden in the shadow of his wide-brimmed hat. "Benjamin!" William screamed, grabbing the magistrate from behind by the shoulders. "Benjamin, you must stop this now! Free them! Your brother promised me!" With a desperate sigh, William spun him around by the shoulders and gazed into an unexpected face. "Giles!" William croaked, his voice a shocked whisper. "Giles Roberts?" "William, please let go of me," the deputy magistrate said softly. "Giles? But... William stammered breathlessly, too astonished to think clearly. Susanna and Martha were now tightly secured to the stakes. The two officers were moving forward with the lighted torches. "Stop! Stop them, Giles!" William demanded. "Stop them at once! Where is Benjamin? Where is Benjamin Fear? I must speak to him before... Giles Roberts took a step back, freeing himself from William's grip. "William, have you not heard?" he asked, staring into William's tear-filled eyes. "Benjamin and his brother Matthew fled the village before dawn this morning."